Now, I want to talk a little bit about the back end side of things, okay? So from the back end side of things, oftentimes that's one place that sometimes people forget to translate things. So for instance, if we look at, there's an article here, this article is not, this is not from Google, this is not from Android, so this is not official recommendations, but they do talk about one method that they use for the server responses, and specifically what they're talking about is the status codes. What I want to pull out of here is just a quick screenshot. If you don't do anything, then your translations are going to look like this. So you might see up at the top that we've got, okay, here's text that's translated. There's a label for the text field. That has been translated. Let me zoom in a little bit. They've translated those because those are in their XML. They've also translated the two button texts, but they haven't translated this text down here that's in that got missed. And the way they're doing that is in code, right? So that's dynamic. It's based on the status code that the server responds. So we don't want things like that to occur. Those are one of the things we need to watch out for. They've also got error messages like this. Everything else is translated, but we've got a flip here. Right? So a lot of this is going to be in terms of working with the view model. This ideally should be stuff that happens in the view model case. Right? So that's kind of what we're dealing with. Right? We want these things to be translated over. Okay? And so oftentimes that means looking at the status code that your APIs return, okay? Now, we don't really have this same system with Firebase. Firebase doesn't really give us status codes when things fail, but we do have this from the eBay perspective. If we're using that REST API, every time we make a request, it could fail. And so we've got a status code that tells us whether or not it succeeds or fails, okay? So with retrofit, you can get that status code. You can get it as an integer by calling response.code. Response.code will tell you what status code the server responds with. Okay? Now, what are the codes? What status code could the API, the EBA API return? What status codes have you seen if you've done some testing? You should have encountered a few along your path of doing the integration. And at least 3. Okay, so 401 is one possibility. Okay, that's one of them. We'll come back to what those codes mean. So 401 is one. What else have you seen? You said 404? Okay. What else? You had a special one, Aaron, because at some point you got to a limit and it says you can't make more requests.
I don't know the exact number.
I think it said too many requests.
Yeah, because everybody was using it at the same time.
Do you remember what code that one was? So we can look it up. It's 429. Okay. So it's really good to know what some of those numbers are. 429. What status code do I get back if I forget to tell it what to search for? If the user doesn't enter any keywords, what status code does it return? If they just leave the search field blank, for instance. Or your product doesn't have a name.
400.
400. Okay. So I can get a 400, I can get a 401, I can get a 404, 429. Are there any other status codes you would expect? You may or may not have seen, but you would expect. Thinking back to third semester, What are some really common status codes that we returned from our own APIs?
403.
403. That was one of them. What else? Brandon, you had a hand up?
That was one I believe.
There's another two I would add to this list. Are these codes all indicating success or failure? Do these indicate success or failure? These are all failure codes, remember? In fact, they're all 400s, right? What did 400 mean? Remember what 400 codes mean? Chase?
Failures. Errors.
It's more specific than that. More specific than that. Yes, errors. Danny?
It's client side?
You said what?
It's client?
Yeah. These are our client-side errors, right? So if you see it starts with 400, that means it's a client-side error. It's a problem with the Android app. It's not a problem with the API. That's what it's telling us, right? These are all indicating there's a problem with your app, not a problem with the server. What if there was a problem with the server? What error would you get? Not that eBay's API would ever go down, but it could, right?
500?
500, right? So we want to plan for that just in case it ever did go down. And so we need to account for the 500 error code, right? So everybody remember what you get for a success? Huh? 200, right? So that's probably the most common one you should be getting is 200, right? If everything's all good and fine, you should be getting a 200 code. Now, it's worth mentioning that actually anything 200 to 299 is considered success, is considered okay. And so if the API returns any of those codes, we can go ahead and just say, that's good, right? So I might actually want to check for that range instead of, say, checking for 200 specifically, because say it's a 201 or a 202, that's still successful. Make sense? So if it's in that range, 200 to 299, the point is what we oftentimes need to do is we need to look at the code that the server gave us and show the user some sort of error message, right? And so it would be helpful if that error message is based on what went wrong. Does that make sense? It would be helpful if that error message is actually based on what went wrong, rather than just saying, hey, I failed to get your eBay listings, right? Because that doesn't tell the user much, doesn't tell the user any way that they can fix it, and good luck trying to contact support and say, hey, it's not working, because your support technician isn't really going to be able to help you. Maybe they can tell you turn it off and back on again. Okay, so I don't want to send the user a message like this. Just to be clear. Error status 400, right? I could do that. They're going to immediately turn around and call support, hopefully, and give that number, but they're not going to be able to troubleshoot it themselves if they see that. Okay? So what I want to do is I want to be able to, when something fails with those requests, I want to be able to provide the user some sort of message that A, we can translate, but also is user-friendly. Does that make sense? Okay? So let's go through some of these messages. Okay? 400. What causes a 400? Well, 400 means bad request, right? So formally, all of these have formal names. So this is bad request. This is unauthorized. 403 is forbidden. 404 is not found. 429 is, we said, too many requests. And this one is known as internal server error, right? So those are the formal kind of definitions of those different codes, right? And again, these are things I could show to the user. It's still not quite that user friendly. Does that make sense? Still not quite that user friendly, because the user's still going to look at these strings and go, that helps me know more than the number. Because your average user, your non-developers, still don't know what these things mean. So, what we need to do as developers in our Android app, we need to provide the user something more friendly. Okay? So, what can we do for 400? Let's start there. So 400 is caused by an error on the client side. And specifically, it means that you haven't provided valid data to the server. Okay? So how would we represent that to the user in a user-friendly way? Just give me a message. Michael. What can we say?
I mean, if it's like an input field or something like that.
Yeah.
It's like invalidated, just say like,
Yeah.
okay, maybe this field is required, or it's like got
Yeah.
an email or something.
That's probably what we should be saying, right? Is saying that some field in there is required, right? In fact, largely one thing to be aware of is if you're using an API right, you should never get 400s. Okay? If your code on the client side is correct, you should never get a 400, right? Because your code should do everything in its power to not make a request that's going to be a 400, right? If it's going to be a 400, that shouldn't ever be a case where you didn't know before you sent it that was going to happen, right? So if you're getting a 400, you just wasted the user's data. You just wasted part of their data plan by sending unnecessary data over the network, okay? So in a 400 case, right, we would want to make a message here, but large in part, we want to prevent it, right? So that's right, okay? So you said something is required, okay? What would you say is required? Does the 400 tell us what is required? Or it doesn't necessarily tell us which field it is, it just tells us it's one of the fields. Okay? Now, what fields from the eBay API, so you're browsing, are required? Huh? The query, the queue, right? The only parameter that is strictly required is query, right? So if you don't set query to something that's not an empty string, you will get a 400, okay? It also could happen that you get a 400 for other things. So let's say you've tried to put in the price filter, but you got some of the syntax wrong. You would still get a 400 for that, okay? But from the user's perspective, the only thing that they can impact is the query string, right? So I might say here, invalid search query. Something like that. or please enter some search terms, right? Now, the user doesn't have a field in our system, right, to actually type that in now, right? It's based on entirely what's in the database, so it's not really the user's job, right? So I might just say something like that because that's more than likely what's incurred, right? Okay. What about the 401? What about the 401?
Maybe this is something like, not have permission to use this feature because it means they're probably not logged in or something, right?
You said what?
It would mean that they're probably not logged in. So
Yeah.
you just probably tell them that they log in or.
Now, there's two ways the 401 could happen, right? So it does mean that they're not logged in, but there's two ways that that could happen. Number one is that they never logged in the first place. So if you didn't ask for an auth token and you didn't provide an auth token, you didn't provide that authorization header to the server, you're not logged in. The other option is you did provide a token and it was invalid, probably expired, right? So if you get a token and you hang on to it for too long, those tokens are only good for so long, right? So it could be either an expired token or it could be that you never got a token in the first place. Okay? Again, think about what the user has control over, right? The user doesn't have control over whether or not you got a token, but they do have some control about the token expiring. So if we tell them that the token is expired, we can give them that possibility of either trying it again, and maybe you get a new token when you try again, or leave the screen and come back, right? So I might want to say something like your authorization token expired, or something of that sort, where I'm telling users some more information in that regard, right? I don't know that these are still the best. I'm still pretty technical when I write these messages, but you understand where we're trying to give the user more information about what went wrong. So yeah, that could still happen. The token expiring is, that's something, again, we kind of want to try and prevent, but we can try to make sure that there's a token before we initiate the request. It's a little bit harder to say for sure that it won't be expired by the time it gets there. Because even just recognizing that there's travel time, so if you're on the edge, it might be that when you sent the request, it wasn't expired, the token wasn't expired, and when it got to the server, it might have been expired. That's possible. So it's not fully preventable like a 400 is. Okay? So we might say that. What about a 403? Remember, 401 is if you're not logged in. 403 is if insufficient permissions, right? So there we have, there we might need to say something about permissions, right? Officially, the word that eBay uses is claims, but the more layman term would be permissions, right? So you might say something like permission denied, or something on that regard, right? We might say, hey, your permission to do this data or to browse the API, to browse the list is denied. What about the 404? When do we get the 404?
Not valid.
Which means,
Page doesn't exist, or
okay. Are we asking for a page? We're asking for JSON data, right? We're asking for an API.
So no data was returned?
You said what?
So no data was returned?
No data was returned?
Or maybe if
So
requested-
it's a good question. Did anybody get a case where they got no search results? Do you remember what the status code was when you got no search results? Might have been 404, but I think eBay returns it as 200. Okay. So I believe that even if you get 0 results, I think it's still a 200. Okay. So if that's the case, then a 404 doesn't indicate that there were no results. It indicates that the URL was wrong. Okay. It indicates that the URL was wrong. How could the URL be wrong? We typed in the URL. We put it into our code. How could that possibly be wrong?
Either like we messed up, or there's a change in the API or something.
It's a good, yeah. So think about it this way. I produce, let's say I write this out, put it out there, and then a year later, I get calls from my users saying, everything's not working anymore. Everything's broken. The eBay integration doesn't work anymore. Might be a change that they've made on the API side. Actually, could be a bunch of things that they've changed on the API side. But if it's a 404 case, that means they've moved the API from this URL to this URL.
Does that happen a lot?
It's one of those things that you would expect never to happen, but does happen sometimes. It is rare, especially for something well established, but I think if you've looked at eBay's API enough, I think we already found some things that they've changed, right? Even just little things like, hey, I can't see sold listings, right? There are things that they've changed. It's highly likely that in a few years that their API might be totally different, right? It might be if you're still using this API, it's possible that you might get a permission denied. It's also possible you might get a 403 because permissions have changed, or you might get a 404 because they've completely moved it to somewhere else, right? They put it on a different domain name, right? Cases where that might, right now, remember they have a production side and a sandbox side, right? They could change those. That's kind of at their whim. The sandbox side is just for testing. So I could make it sandbox 2 or change the URL for that. I could say, hey, there's a sandbox for Europe and America, and maybe have separate sandboxes, right? So those kind of things could happen, right?
Well, the sandbox changes probably wouldn't really affect our users too much, right? They don't
Right.
make the changes.
Yeah, which is why I was suggesting it's more likely that they might move the sandbox than the real production API, right? But so we could say something in regards to, API has moved, right? That would be one thing we could say in this case, right? We could say, hey, the API has moved to somewhere else. Or I could say something like API URL incorrect, right? Because we know something like that. We know that, right? We know either API has moved somewhere else or whatever we're putting in is an incorrect URL. that might just be, it could be the domain name changes, it also could just be the path that's changed, okay? So it's something that you wouldn't expect, but you actually want to plan for just in case it does happen, because then at least users can have a meaningful message to feed back to you. Okay, what about a 429? Aaron, I'm going to put this to you because you're the first one that got into this. What would you tell a user then if there were too many requests?
It happened when we were all searching it, so it was like,
Yeah,
we were kind of like, I guess they were mad because we were hitting the API too many times.
too many times, yeah. Now, I think we were on the sandbox API at that time too, and not the production. And so
No,
rules
it
may
was-
be
It was
different.
production, wasn't it?
Was it? It might have been production. Okay. So what can we tell the user?
You just have to tell them to try again later.
Yeah, maybe. Because the server's kind of overloaded, right? So I might say something like, server overloaded. Now, please try again later is kind of problematic for a lot of users. Because what do users do if you say, please try again later?
Try again
Yeah. If you tell a user, please try again later, you're just going to keep hitting F5. Because you didn't tell them how long it's going to take to come back. Okay?
Although could it also be an issue if you gave them a specific time though too, because then they're all gonna wait. Like if you said like please wait 15 minutes, then they're all gonna wait 15 minutes and then try again at the same time, or
That's a good theory. Yeah, that's a good question. They'll probably wait that much time and then try again later. Now, that's only an issue if a bunch of users have the error at the same time, which is probably going to happen in this case, right? We said that this is likely when there's a bunch of users using the system, right? So what do I tell them?
would you say like a few minutes? Since some might wait
Okay.
longer, some might try again, so maybe they'll.
Now, just from experience and having coded a little bit of this from the back end, if you hit a 429, waiting a few minutes is probably not going to fix it. Okay? Because this is where we talk about overload protection and spam protection. This is where, if you're getting a 429, you've kicked into spam protection, just a few minutes is not necessarily likely to get you there. And I think that, yeah, Evan responded with 5,000 requests per day. Okay, now the threshold is per day, right? If I wait a few minutes, that threshold's not going away. So, when can I try again? Tomorrow. So, a better message would be to say, try again tomorrow. Yeah, because I'm talking about tomorrow, people are probably not going to all come back in at the same time. They might, but
I don't know if this would be important or not, but is it like 24 hours from whenever you got the code, or is it like per, like, I guess at midnight, or, you know?
yeah, that's a good question as well, right? I don't know that, right? And you can implement your thresholds on the back end either way. You can say, that's really a server side thing. I could say per calendar day. I could say also for a 24-hour period. So I might say 24 from that first response of the 5,000, but I could also take 24 from that 5,000th request, right? I don't know. So the best thing I can do is say tomorrow and leave it vague, because hopefully tomorrow it works. Because that's the best I can say. But I don't want to just say later, because they might think, oh, it'll work in a few minutes, it'll work in a few seconds, it'll work in a few hours, but it's not even that, it's tomorrow, because we've exceeded that limit. Now, the right way to deal with that also means changing things in such a way that when you're getting those results from ABA, you save them to your database. And if I save them to my database, then I don't have to hit eBay's API every time. I can just say, oh, let's check if we've already run that query. If I've already run that query in, say, today, then I just go pull that up from the database, and I don't have to count from that 5,000. So as long as you're caching the results, okay, I can run 5,000 different queries every day, right? Rather than where you're sitting right now is because we're not saving or caching any of the data, I can search for keyboards 5,000 times and hit that limit, right? Does that make sense? So there are ways you can offload that. And that's another, it's also another reason why you want to have everybody having your own API key. So you're not dishing into some other app's API limits, right? Because you can only control your app. You can't control somebody else's app, right? You can't control what other usage is there, but I can control what my app is doing. Okay. And so that puts us all the way down to 500. What about that one? Well, usually 500s. This has been my experience with anything based on PHP and MySQL. Usually if I'm getting a 400, it's because it's failing to connect to the database for one reason or another, right? So more often than not, if you're getting a 500, that's what it is. It's a problem with them, their API connecting with their database, okay? That's not necessarily going to resolve itself quickly, and you don't know how long that's going to take to resolve. So I might say, something on the order of server error. Please try again tomorrow. Because, again, I don't know how long it's going to take them to fix it. So, right? Again, rather than saying later, because later means, hey, it might be fixed in a few seconds. Right? So does that kind of make sense in terms of, hey, we want to give the user some sort of error message, right? Well, so that means all of these different messages for the different status codes need to be, we want to make sure these are getting translated. So it means we need to be all extracted, okay? So how can I, kind of putting some pieces together, I want to give the user whatever appropriate error message for the status code that they've received. Okay, so I've already told you that we can get the status code this way. How do I then go to produce the appropriate message? Well, I've got numbers. I know what those numbers mean. I know I have messages for them. What would be my next step? Well, I probably want to do one of two things, and I could do an if statement, or a series of if statements. I could do a switch. Either one's fine, right? Give and take as far as that goes. But it is a good fit for a switch because switches do work really well with numbers, which we have. So I might say switch on the status code. Say, hey, based on whatever API code, status code the user we got back, we've got our cases. So we only need to do this in the error cases. Case 401. Case, and maybe I will cover the 200 case. Case 401, case 403, case 429, and case 500. Okay. Enough of these errors occur rarely enough. It's just worth mentioning in future as you're building and working with these kind of things, you usually want to see, anytime I see a new status code, okay, let me go ahead and put a new case in here for that status code if I see something new. Because I'm probably not going to see it again anytime soon. Oh, and I missed 404, right? So I might have, that's what we're looking at. Remember, what I want to do is I want to end up showing a message to the user. This code is going to go into a view model, okay? So I probably want to update some sort of live data, right? So what should I do in these different cases? Start with 400. Be a good thing to do here. Now, we need to update live data, right? So I might have something like, hey, maybe we have sort of error message, right? Whatever our error message live data is. I might say, hey, let's post a value. And so it looked like post value r.string dot eBay 400 status. Right? Might look something like that, right? As far as getting the message translated and into something that's user friendly. Make sense? Pretty easy, kind of putting some things together. We've talked about both this semester and the previous semester, right? We've talked about some of the stuff in third semester and fourth semester. So I want to do something like this. Remember, for every case that we have, we also need to break it. So it might look something like this. Okay. Now, if I start thinking about, what is this going to look like? I might start writing things down. I might say, hey, this is 401. And start feeding these in, 403, 404, 429, 500. What do I do in the 200 case? Well, 200 is successful. So I probably just want to set that to null. Say, hey, there's no n. Okay. Now, this code works. I hope you can see that it looks pretty redundant, right? I'm writing almost the same thing in every case. Is there some way that I can make this less redundant? Thinking dry. Don't repeat yourself. So I'm repeating myself a lot. Where are the parts that are repeated? Error message of profiling. Okay. So that's repeated in all of these cases, even the 200 case. What about this r.string? That's repeated, right? Okay. This part I can extract. I can make that occur in one place rather than in every case. This part I can't extract because this is the name of a variable in the field, right? So this can't be dynamic. That part, even though it looks like the same, you cannot make that part dynamic, okay? But this part, I can, okay? So there's no way for me to just to be clear that r.string is that part you have to repeat. There's no way around it. So, okay, how can I get that error post value into one place? Well, if in the switch statement, it's going to be repeated, right? So I need to either move it before or after the switch statement. Does that make sense? Before or after? Can I move it before? No, because I don't know what to post, right? I could move it after, because then maybe I know what to post, right? Thoughts? Suggestions? Yeah.
So you put the whole thing in a function and just return that?
Yes.
And then get rid of the
That's
phrase?
usually what I do. I usually introduce a function here. So what I might want to do, oftentimes when I've got switch statements, it's often worth introducing a function. And so I might call this something like integer get error message for status code, something of this type. And I might pass in int status code, wrap this up. So we've got kind of a switch statement, tab that over, size it down, and say this is going to return that. Now notice that I intentionally made it an uppercase integer because I need to allow for that null case for 200, where it might not have an error message. So here I might say, okay, let's take this part out. And so I might say something like integer message ID, call this function with the status code, and finally post that ID. So that's kind of what I'm trying to get to. Yeah, the benefit of doing that is I can collapse this really far, return null, because if I go down to returns, part of the beauty of return is that it finishes the function, so you actually don't need to break because the function's already going to exit. So I can get down to something like that, and I'm just going to repeat this for all of these. So it might look like, hey, 401 is 401, 403 is 403, 429 is 429, and 500 is 500, and again I've skipped over 404. I don't know why 404 is the one I'm skipping. Does that kind of make sense? So I would do something like this in terms of handling the error messages, and that way you actually are really cutting down on, let's say I have different places where I need to do this. It's a lot easier to bring it in rather than copying this code multiple times. Make sense? So that's how I would tackle the translation side on the server response, right? So you set up some sort of map, in this case a switch statement, that maps from the status code to here's the ID of the message that I want to show. Cool? And so then that can be different, like we talked about above. So those would be those messages that we put into string resources. Part of what this, in terms of asking why we want to do this is going to, oftentimes things like this are going to end up in more than one class. So I might want to, in fact, oftentimes if I'm working with an API, I'm often working with that on a whole lot of activities or a whole lot of fragments. So I don't want to have to write that every new view model that I create. This is something I could just actually notice that this could be a static method because it doesn't refer to any instance variables at all. It only refers to strictly the status code. So this is something I might even throw into another class and just make it static, and then that way I can reuse it. Cool. So that's how I would tackle that.